this. All right. Welcome, folks. This is Ann Arbor Real Estate Investors Club, our fundamentals series. We've been going kind of in sequence of finding deals, analyzing deals, funding the deals, negotiating deals, writing the purchase agreement, and now the progression goes to due diligence, because this is the time period after an offer has been accepted, and before it closes. So this is the time period of the contract really where the rubber meets the road, and there's a lot of flurry of information back and forth, and it gets into frenzied communications quite often. And especially we're in the world where we do phone calls, we do text, we do email, we do all of it. And typically when the clock is ticking, the pressure is on. So it's good to be as proactive as possible and do the best you can to anticipate problems before they actually become problems. But there'll always be curveballs that come in, and hopefully this will prepare you a little bit to handle those as well. Here is my disclaimer that I don't think you guys have seen. I used to put this slide on every presentation, but it's appropriate today because I've had a bumpy week, and which I often do, but some weeks are better than others. But I always use this as a self-reminder that, the real estate business is difficult and you need to build resilience. And hopefully you can, again, learn from me and learn it sooner rather than later, that there will be setbacks, there will be mistakes, there will be, you can call them failures. I've learned over the years to not call the down things failures. I call them learning opportunities. And if you shift your mindset a little bit, it kind of has a tendency to either pick you back up or keep you going. But this is a good one. This is Sergeant Hartman from Full Metal Jacket, if you guys know that movie. But anyway, that's it. You know what we're about: learning, networking, deal making, and do reset every week, every day. Put these ideas at the top of your mind and work through them every day, and hopefully you can do something, advance yourself in any of these three areas or all of them on a daily basis. We do the fundamentals series because, if you get the fundamentals down, the level of everything you do will rise. I love this quote, and therefore that's why I share it. Here's the sequence that I just alluded to a couple slides ago. As I said, the last three: power team, property management, multifamily, a couple other subjects will come a little bit down the road. The schedule in March is going to be a little bit lighter than it was in February because I'm going to be gone for a week. That's number one. But so stay tuned for future Zoom classes on these topics. All right, today's objectives. You guys have been here before, so you know kind of how I think and how I approach it. I try and learn to approach things in a systematic way and a sequential way, which a lot of people don't do in real estate because it's kind of, scattered, and people have a tendency to do things and spend time and money and effort on things that, they don't matter unless, item number 3 on your to-do list doesn't matter if you haven't done 1 or 2. So let's take a step back and do these in a sequential manner that makes the most sense to do from an efficiency standpoint. And again, something I learned the hard way. So these are the main objectives in your due diligence is obviously the title work is key and it's important in every transaction, but especially more so with investors if you're doing a deal where realtors are not involved in the transaction. If it's only the buyer and the seller, or maybe a wholesaler, or maybe maybe an attorney, and the attorney might not necessarily be a real estate attorney. You need to be more acutely aware of the title work and the process and who gets involved with that. And obviously, that's a title company because the transaction needs to filter through a title company to make sure what you're buying is what you think you're buying. And if you're selling, you want to represent to the buyer that you're selling what you have the right to sell. So that's kind of obviously, step one. Reviewing books, records, both online and offline, and the intricacies involved with that is the second part of the sequence. Property disclosures, very important. And if you remember, I talked about them in contracts, that the seller's disclosures are really another form of a contract. So kind of, putting the magnifying glass on those disclosures. Um, Home inspections, property inspections, which is not just kind of one thing, and I'll get into that in a subsequent slide. Um, Renegotiation, because the essence of the due diligence period is that you're learning things about the property that you didn't know before you signed the contract. So it's always in your mind, um, who, would knowing this now when you didn't know it when you signed it, how does that impact what you agreed to in the original agreement? A lot of times it's, well, like, okay, well, I didn't know that, and that's unpleasant, but it's not a deal breaker. So everything in the renegotiation piece is, does this new knowledge now make it a deal breaker or not? And that's kind of the essence of it. And there's elements of it, and I was talking about it, at the beginning. When you're purchasing a property that might have multiple offers on it, but you have a signed agreement on it, but there are other buyers waiting in the wings. Your leverage on renegotiation, that's a whole strategy in and of itself, and that could be a whole separate class. But basically, when there are multiple offers, your leverage and your opportunity to renegotiate dwindles um, proportionately, as they say. Number six is coordinating closing, and that's kind of really a formality, but it's an element of the negotiation, and it's part. I mean, it's the last step in the sequence, so hence it's on this session. So here's a key concept that it took me a while to learn. Um, and it's the concept of control. And this is one of the areas of real estate investing that if you don't know, you don't know. So now you're going to know. So I kind of try and make this as black and white as I can for simplicity's sake, but you really encourage you to get in the mindset of, okay, where am I? And as far as this particular property is concerned, and who has control of the property. And control of the property, I'll explain in the next slide, but understand the importance of control. And the idea of starting some due diligence before you have control, and what type of due diligence you should do, because the type of due diligence you do before you have control impacts your negotiation and impacts your offer accordingly. So you want to be able to do and the bottom line on this is you want to do as much due diligence as you can before you have control. All right. You want to do as much as you can, as much homework as you can, because that benefits you in the negotiation. But you don't want to do so much control that if you don't get the deal, you've wasted time and, more importantly, money. And I'll elaborate on that in the next couple slides. So what is control? And it's kind of sort of obvious, but not so obvious. But control is when you have the purchase agreement signed. Okay, you have what we talked about in the last couple weeks is you've got a purchase agreement signed by the buyer, by the seller, that the seller agrees to sell this property at a certain price under the following terms and with these following conditions. Okay. So once the seller signs that, there's a window of time between the time that contract was bottom line and between the date you put on the contract where it's supposed to close. So typically in real estate transactions, it's 30 days or 45 days, which everyone understands that that's the time period for the buyer to do his or her due diligence. All right. But there are other times where that time period is shorter, or there's a lot of due diligence things that simply get waived for one reason or another. Um, but that's the due diligence period. And here is the key that I made this a couple slides ago, but it's worth repeating, that there is no doubt you know, 99 times out of 100, you will learn things about the property. Some might be positive, but they're usually something that's negative, that you learn about the property during the due diligence period that you didn't know about or couldn't have known about, or maybe you were deceived, or for whatever reason you didn't know about when you signed the original contract. So this is the thought process you need to go through, is that, you know, uh, and this circles back to, your buy box and your criteria, is that during this due diligence period, you will learn things about the property that perhaps take the property out of your particular buy box for one reason or another. Usually it's, more repairs needed than you imagined, or mold is discovered, or a foundation issue, or a roof leak, or things that things that are potentially major that you didn't anticipate. But here's where you really, you need to have an examination with yourself of your buy box. And what I don't encourage you to do, yet a lot of investors do, is, they learn bad things about the property that takes it out of their buy box, and all of a sudden it makes a good deal into a bad deal, but they continue on with it because they've gone down the road so far and they've fallen in love with it, and they convince themselves that they can still make it a good deal. And this is especially the case if there are other buyers interested in it. The average investor will start looking over his or her shoulder and saying, well, wait a minute, there's other buyers that think that there's money here. I still have control of the property. I'm going to go ahead despite looking at it as a business deal. And I had this conversation with a client literally an hour ago, that you have to stick to your buy box, and you have to adopt the mindset that if this deal falls apart because it goes out of my buy box, that there's going to be another opportunity down the road. And that's a discipline that I encourage you to engage with yourself, but you're the only one that can make that determination. Um, but what I do and I recommend on this slide when I talk about negotiation and the renegotiation step is that if there are things, let's say it's a roof leak or a foundation issue, something major really that any other buyer would find, okay, this is the point in the process where you have control of the property, all right? And the seller might say, well, hey, Brian, I've got two or three other buyers waiting in line behind you. If you back out, okay, this is my opportunity to say, well, look, Mr. Seller, yeah, I understand that, but I now know things that those buyers don't know. Okay. When they find out, are they going to go ahead anyway? I now know about them. I didn't know about it before. I think that any other buyer would find the same thing that I am now finding and objectively want to renegotiate for whatever reason. This is the old, bird in the hand argument, and it's a cliche, but it works. It's like, look, Mr. Seller, I'm here. I'm still under contract. The clock is still ticking to closing. I'm still interested in the property, but I've learned something about it that I didn't know before or couldn't have known before. Um, are you willing to make a concession? And that's where the rubber meets the road in negotiation. And the seller could say, no, screw you. I'm going on to the next one. Or, they can take a breath. And as I taught in the negotiation class, I am trying to put the seller in my shoes or, have him step into my shoes as an investor buyer. And what would the seller, do if he were in my shoes? So that's the whole dance of the due diligence at its essence. So the property may still be worth pursuing if the seller is willing to make concessions for the things that you didn't predict and the things that you didn't calculate in your analysis, because now you have to redo your analysis based on what you found in the due diligence. And I hope that makes sense. 6 steps for due diligence before control. So these are things to do, your to-do list, and I have a cheat sheet that I'll put in the chat afterwards that has all this stuff on there. But these are the things, this is doing your homework before you put pen to paper on the sales contract. All right. A lot of time you don't have opportunity to do this. This is something that you can work on with your team, your realtor can gather some of this information for you and help you walk through these six, easy for me to say, 6 steps. Okay. Seller's disclosures, we talked about during the negotiation class. They're really a contract. The seller has a real obligation to disclose what he knows about the property, especially in the way of defects. Sellers don't always do that. A matter of fact, you can expect sellers not doing that or downplaying things. So you have to take what they give you, trust but verify. So that's the key to that. It's not like sellers' disclosures are an act of fiction, but they often are. And you should look at them potentially that way. But there's valuable stuff in there in the disclosures for which can prompt you to ask more questions or something you can share with an inspector, because an inspector is not going to, You can't rely, again, you can't rely on the sellers completely. You can't rely on the inspector completely. It all ends up in your lap anyway. But the information you get from the seller, you can share with the inspector, and that has value. Okay. Um, and the inspector likewise can use that information for you to go back to the seller and say, hey, my inspector says X. Do you know anything more about it? And again, the seller, you want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt as much as you can. The seller might say, oh, yeah, now that you mention it, why? Okay. Where the seller is not intentionally withholding something from you, but these sellers are not filling out these disclosures regularly. They might sell a house once every 10 years or every 30 years. And they may genuinely say, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. And that's a legitimate thing that happens. And then there are others that are intentionally saying, oh, no, no, the basement was never flooded, blah, blah, blah. And then the neighbor will say, well, guy's pulling your chain because he was out here in wading boots a couple of years ago, when the whole neighborhood flooded. So that kind of stuff. Due diligence is obviously looking at the property ahead of time. There are some investors I work with that don't do that. They say because they might be making 10 offers a week, and they're saying, well, I'll do my property tour if I get my offer accepted. That's their strategy, and that's the way they want to do business. I don't recommend doing it that way, but I can't. Everybody's on their own. Everybody is an adult, and everybody has their own big boy pants or big girl pants. Do online research as far as taxes, Googling the property, Google Earth. Um, Whatever you might find. There are online records as far as things like taxes, taxable value, state equalized value. Though that type of financial information is usually online, but there are a lot of sites, municipality sites where the property is located, where you can dig into the building department. And Washington County, you've got to go through a lot of red tape and bureaucratic layers, but you can find out uh, what what permits have been pulled with the city or municipality for what work that's been done with the property over the years. Um, this used to be, an investor in the group who was also an inspector, and ultimately went to work for the city of Milan as a city inspector. If he was going to buy a property or thinking about buying a property, he would walk into the building department of the municipality and say, hey, I'm looking at 123 Main Street to buy it. Do you know anything about it, or can you help me pull the records on it? And usually the people in the building department are quite happy, and I wouldn't say that, but they're there to help you. And if it's the smaller the community, the more they might know about the property without having to look it up. So that's always a good resource, because likely you'd be going back there for building permits if you're buying a distressed property and building it up and rehabbing it or whatever. So you want to get to know them anyway. Um, FEMA floodplain, there's an online uh, federal website that tells you whether or not the property is in a floodplain. Your insurance agent, that's the first thing he or she looks at when you call them up, and say, hey, I'm looking at buying this property. What am I going to be paying in insurance? That's part of step 4. Utilize your network. Okay. Your insurance agent, your landscaper, your inspector, your contractor, engage them. Hey, Bill, hey, Bob, hey, Sandy, I'm looking at buying this house. I want to engage with you to do X, Y, and Z. This one in yellow, I got burned and learned the hard way. And if you're writing a contract with someone, again, this is especially if you're doing it without a realtor. But again, you can't count on every realtor to do this because it's very easy to get a realtor's license. Um, but it doesn't mean you're smart, and it doesn't mean you know what you're doing, and it doesn't mean that you do your own due diligence. And I will fully fall on the sword that I didn't do my own due diligence once, and I took a listing for a property and got an offer on it, and then come to find out that my seller who wrote the listing agreement didn't own the property. I found that out, so my pants were fully down around the ankles, if you know what I mean. So when you're thinking about buying a property, obviously this is done with a realtor. You'd say to your realtor, you know, who's doing the closing, and the title company does that. So the title company is the one who verifies the seller. So you want to engage the title company even before you write the offer. And you can assume this if you're working with a buyer's agent like me, because I've learned to do this the hard way, um, or working with an agent. You know, do you have verification of the seller? That's something that you can find out from the public records, but even the public records are not always flawless. Um, so that's why you want the title company to verify the seller. Step 6 is lining up the inspector, contractor's estimates, etc. This is the case again in the negotiation where if you've got your inspector lined up, if you've got your contractor lined up, and it's a motivated seller where the seller doesn't want to necessarily wait 30 or 45 days for you to do all this, it gives you a leg up in your negotiations if you can say, okay, Mr. Seller, I've got my contractor lined up, I've got my inspector lined up, I have my money lined up, I can close this deal in 7 days or 10 days. Where again, if you're in a multiple offer situation, that gives you a leg up. If all the other offers are 30 days to close, 45 days to close, you come in with an offer with 10 days to close, you go to the head of the line. This is stuff that you can do before you have the contract signed. Um, Due diligence after control. Okay, so the ink is now dry on the contract. Seller has signed, you have signed as the buyer. And you're going to do this after you have control, because it's you that have control of the property, of going through with the sale, or force, the things go south, potentially forcing the seller to go through the sale with the terms you've agreed on. But this is after control because these steps typically involve you as a buyer cash money out of pocket. So you don't, for example, you don't want to pay a home inspector to inspect the property where the seller can say, oh, well, that's nice, thank you very much, but I'm selling it to somebody else. And you're out, the whatever it is that you spent for the inspector. Likewise with a sewer scope. Likewise, if you want to do a mold inspection, those are all cash money out of pocket for you, the buyer, that you don't want to put that out if you don't have control of the property. Because you'll say, and I see it happen all the time with investors who hadn't learned this until now. Wait a minute, I just paid 300 for a sewer scope and 500 for an inspection. I thought we had a deal. Well, no, we don't have a deal. Where's the signed purchase agreement? Well, here's here's the text that said we had a deal. No, it's got to be on a legally binding contract with both signatures, which means that you have control. That means that you are the only one who can back out of it legally. I mean, not to say that it doesn't happen otherwise, but that's for a different class. Okay. If you're doing financing, an appraisal is involved, you have to pay for an appraisal. And all of these things happen after you have the contract, but before the closing. All right. Renegotiation, I talked about in the previous slide. Removing contingencies. A typical example of this is the same one I used in negotiation, where inspector, you have the property under contract, have a home inspection. You didn't go up in the attic when you looked at the property, but your inspector went up in the attic. He said, "Oh, okay, there's bats in here, or there's mold up here." All right, you didn't go up there, so you didn't see it, you didn't know it. And that's when that's when uh, inspector might say, well, I think there's bats, or I think there's mold. Inspector's not going to go too far out on a limb. They're going to say, you ought to call a specialist in here, you ought to call a pest guy, or you ought to call a mold guy. And that's when you have the contingencies and you're renegotiating, and you say, well, all right, I've had the inspection, home inspector suspects pests in the attic. I would like to have an extension of that contingency so I can get a specialist to come in and see yay or nay, and what degree of mold is there, or what type of pests there might be, on all like that. And this is where I'll make the point again. Seller might say, nope, it's as is. You should have known, you should have gone in the attic when you saw it. I'm not renegotiating. I'm not agreeing to the extension. I'm not letting a mold guy come in, whatever. That's case by case, deal by deal. You want to import to the seller that, look, any other buyer behind me is going to come and do the same thing. You might as well deal with me if I'm still willing to do the deal or not. You might not be willing to do the deal. You might say, it's got mold. I don't want to deal with it. Let's go on to the next one. Closing date, again, special circumstances is part of the due diligence, and potentially part of a renegotiation, depending on what you find during the due diligence period. And I have a situation with mold. I can get a mold guy in there real quickly to test, but the mold company is very busy. I can't get him in quickly enough to fix the mold. I'm representing the seller. Seller says, oh, of course we want to fix the mold. We can't schedule the mold remediator guy within the time frame of our contract, because the mold guy doesn't care about our contract. He's got his own schedule. So that's where that element comes in. Okay. Types of inspections. So you think inspections, oh, home inspection, he's gonna check the plugs and check for leakage, this and that. Here, there are multiple types of inspections in addition to the standard home inspection. All right, that's the main one, but these are other types of inspections you need to put on your radar screen. And, depending on the property you're buying, these may or may not, these other types of inspections may or may not come into play. But you need to be aware of them, and now you are aware of them. And I'll have this as a checklist for you to ask questions about. Typically your home inspector will ask you these questions anyway, but he may or may not. And there's certain type of properties as a home inspector, I mean, as an investor, um, for example, if you're buying a commercial property or a multi-unit property, there's a requirement for an environmental inspection that's not part of a typical home inspection for a typical single family home. Those are little nuances that you'll learn as you go. But the key ones are the standard home inspection, where they inspect what we call the big six, which I talk about in rehab, and I've got it on the sheet. Is the roof, the foundation, the plumbing, the electrical, the HVAC, and the landscaping. Those are the big ticket items that are really, any one of them, depending on what you find, are potentially the deal breakers. The key one is water, and as water damage to the foundation, because if the property foundation is compromised, which is usually by water, it's to a degree by shifting, or if there's a tree next to the house or something like that. But water is the main number one thing. That's something that you want to be on your radar screen as you're looking at these properties. Does water get into the basement? How does it get in? How bad is it? That type of thing. Sewer scope, always recommended. Um, a sewer scope, if you don't know, it's like a house colonoscopy where they take a camera and go from the highest level toilet down all the way to the tap in for the city sewer. And they do it with a camera. So it sees if there's roots in there, or cracks in there, or leaks in there, or debris in there, or all that stuff. That is a really, really major ticket item if there's bad things found in there, and it's typically an inspection that is overlooked by the novice or those not in the know. Obviously, pests. Some might be visible to the eye, some might not be. Same with mold. Is it on a floodplain? Work with your insurance guy. Environmental and survey, again, those are more for commercial type properties than regular single family residential. Has there been non-permitted work? This is typical if you're buying it, the older the property is, the more likely some type of non-permitted work has been done to the property over the life of the property. And who knows how many owners there have been? Have there been one owner, 5 owners, 10 owners? Who knows? But quite often, the older the property and the more owners there have been through the history of the property, the more likely it has been unpermitted work, which has either been done properly or improperly. And if it was non-permitted, it was likely improperly, because that's why it wasn't permitted. So you need to do your due diligence on that, as part of the due diligence period. And that's something that's really getting into the weeds, that, again, you're not going to really want to spend the time doing that unless you're the one who has the ability to walk away from the deal, because you can spend days and hours researching that type of stuff. But all very important. Um, here's your uh, here's your power team that you need to execute this plan. You want to determine, as part of the due diligence process, because the title company is going to ask this question. They'll ask it early on. How do you want to hold title in this property? That circles back to uh, your planning and your buy box, and what type of legal, are, if you're a private owner and you're renting this out, you don't want it in your personal name. So this is where you assemble your power team of your CPA for tax reasons, your attorney for legal reasons, your financial advisor for financial advising reasons. As all right, I'm closing on this property. What is it going to, is it going to be Brian Bundison buying the property? Is it going to be Bundison Real Estate LLC buying the property? Is it going to be 123 Main Street LLC? So I have a different LLC for each property. All those kind of questions you got to be prepared to answer. And again, the clock is ticking, that you don't want to be wrestling with this stuff while the clock is ticking to the closing date. Want to do this, be proactive and do this ahead of time. Um, each property you add to your portfolio, unless you're doing a wholesale or a flip, even if you're doing a flip, not necessarily a wholesale, um, you should have a will. Will needs to be updated when assets are added and subtracted from the will. I'm the executor of the will of my sister, and she does quite a bit of real estate. And transactions come and go. And as the transactions come and go, the will has to be changed accordingly. Insurance, all right. You have to queue all this up because, again, you don't want to sign a contract on the property, then call your insurance agent, and he says, "Oh my God, Brian, what the hell did you do? Your insurance is going to be through the roof." When you have to do the insurance in the analysis phase, not in the due diligence phase. That's my point. Because it can make a good deal into a bad deal. It can A, blow the deal, or make it so cost prohibitive that it's not going to be a profitable deal and it's outside your buy box. But again, you're not going to wait till due diligence to have to know what you're looking at insurance wise. Okay. But I put it here because everybody waits to the last minute, and it's something that I used to do, but I learned again the hard way not to be more pro. Oh, gee, it dawned on me. Yeah, that's a good idea. I should talk to my insurance guy before I write the offer, so I know how that's gonna impact my analysis and how much wiggle room I have to renegotiate, um, which was a step from a few slides ago. All right, that is the end of the line. I'll go through the cheat sheet shortly. Joseph just finished this book on vacation and gives it a few good stars. For those, I know a couple folks jumped on the call after we started. This book is my group's Bible. It really opens your eyes about real estate, whatever eye aperture you had open coming into real estate investing that I don't know about, which I don't know much because I don't know you guys and what you know and what you don't know and what your goals are and all that. But this really expands your horizons and really gives you different ways to look at the whole subject of real estate investing. So buy the book, read the book, do what the book says. That's kind of as simple as I can get. Here's our upcoming events. I am going to put on, I don't have the date finalized yet. It's a little bit fluid based on my schedule, the investor schedule, the weather, and a few other moving parts. But we have an investor who's in the middle of a flip right now, and he's invited us to come and take a look at his progress, and he will give, like a little mini seminar on site at his flip. We used to do those a lot. I'd like to do a few more of those. So potentially the end of March, we'll be doing an on-site, you know, on location mid-flip meetup. But otherwise, we got the two rainmakers. Next Friday, I'm going to talk about compensation agreements, which is a result of a relatively new National Association of Realtors rules as a result of a lawsuit. I'll talk about that next week. Very important to know. Again, knowing the compensation agreement is part of your due diligence before you enter into a contract. So you're being a really smart investor and a proactive investor because, again, most realtors, and I have been guilty of it in the past, that I don't talk about the compensation until we're further along down the road into a transaction. This is for you as the investor to be proactive about the compensation piece of the transaction early on in the transaction, upstream. So you're that much smarter and that much further ahead than anybody else in the transaction. Very important. Um, yeah, I've explained a couple times about membership and how I am approaching membership in this group. If you're going to become an engaged member, and if you're going to become engaged, and if you find value in my teachings, and if what you get out of the group, okay, um, I ask you to show your appreciation. Is basically that. We can talk more individually about that based on your particular circumstance. And that's it. So I'm going to stop the share.